I put the poison in her tea. I watched her drink it.
You are a soulless murderer! You will die in prison for this!
The Portland, Oregon courtroom fell into a stunned silence as Judge Magnus Thorne leaned forward, his steel-gray eyes fixed on the small figure seated at the defense table, an 11-year-old girl whose feet didn't quite reach the floor. Tina Grace Weldon sat motionless, her pale blonde hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, wearing a navy blue dress that made her look even younger than her 11 years, her face a mask of eerie calm as the judge pronounced the words that would soon ignite a national firestorm. For the premeditated murder of your mother, Amy Corrine Weldon, this court sentences you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, Judge Thorne declared, his voice rising with each word until it filled every corner of the hushed courtroom. You have committed the most unnatural of crimes, the murder of the very person who gave you life, and it is the judgment of this court that you will die in prison for this matricide. The spectators in the gallery gasped collectively, reporters frantically typing on their phones, the flash bulbs creating a strobe-like effect that illuminated Tina's face in harsh pulses of light. Yet the girl's expression never changed, not a flinch, not a tear, nothing to indicate she comprehended the severity of what had just happened. In the back of the courtroom, Detective Kira Ross watched with a troubled expression, her mind flashing back to the morning of June 12, 2023, when she had arrived at the modest craftsman home in Portland's Selwood neighborhood to find Amy Weldon's body sprawled across her floral bedspread, an empty teacup on the nightstand beside her, and Tina sitting cross-legged on the living room sofa, calmly reading a book. She didn't feel anything at the end, the child had said, without looking up from her page, her voice as flat and matter-of-fact as if she were reciting multiplication tables. The poison works that way if you give enough at once. I researched it at the library. Before we continue, we'd love to hear what you think about this case. Subscribe to our channel and comment below telling us where you're watching from. We're always fascinated to see how far these true crime stories reach. The detective had been stunned into momentary silence, her 15 years on Portland's Homicide Division having never prepared her for a confession delivered so coldly by someone so young, the memory of it sending an involuntary shiver down her spine, even now as she watched the courtroom drama unfold. "Ma'am, do you understand what you're telling me?" Ross had asked, kneeling down to meet the girl's eye level, searching for some sign of confusion or trauma that might explain these disturbing statements. Tina had finally looked up then, her blue eyes clear and direct, lacking the fear or remorse one might expect, and said the words that would haunt Detective Ross throughout the investigation and trial. "She was already killing me. I just made it fair." As the bailiff moved to escort Tina from the courtroom, her small wrists disappearing inside the adult-sized handcuffs, a commotion erupted near the gallery doors. A woman with a medical badge tried to push forward, shouting something about evidence and prior diagnoses, but court officers quickly intercepted her. The chaos swelled around the small figure at its center, yet Tina's gaze remained fixed straight ahead, her posture rigid and her expression unchanged, as though she existed in a different reality from the pandemonium surrounding her. The door to the holding area swung shut behind her, cutting off the view of her retreating form, but not before Detective Ross noticed something that hadn't been visible during the trial. A series of small, circular bruises along the child's exposed neck, partially hidden by her collar, bruises consistent with needle injections administered by someone else. The Portland rain pelted against the courthouse windows, a fitting backdrop to the darkness that had just unfolded within its walls, as members of the press rushed out to broadcast the unprecedented sentence: a child condemned to die in prison. Outside on the courthouse steps, protesters had already begun to gather, their signs visible through the rain-streaked glass, some demanding justice for Amy Weldon, others protesting the sentence as cruel and unusual punishment. Detective Ross remained seated long after the courtroom had emptied, her case file open before her, staring at the photograph of Amy Weldon, the woman Portland had mourned as a devoted, self-sacrificing single mother, juxtaposed with the toxicology report that would later raise disturbing questions about who had been poisoning whom. The story that had captivated Portland began 7 months earlier on that rainy June morning, when emergency services received a call from Tina Weldon, her voice unnervingly composed for a child reporting her mother's death. The modest home on S.E. Lexington Street, with its carefully tended garden and cheerful yellow door, had given no outward indication of the darkness harbored inside, where Amy Weldon had built her identity around being the selfless caretaker of a chronically ill child. Neighbors stood in shocked clusters behind the police tape that morning, telling reporters that Amy was a saint who had dedicated her life to caring for Tina through mysterious health crises, frequent hospital visits, and what appeared to be a debilitating condition that medical specialists had struggled to diagnose definitively. Tina was always so quiet, so sickly-looking, explained Sharon Norris, who lived next door and was among the first interviewed by Detective Ross that morning, her voice quavering with emotion. Amy was constantly taking her to specialists, Portland Children's, OHSU, even that medical center in Seattle, and fundraising for treatments through the church. The image of the devoted mother contradicted sharply with the scene inside the house, where investigators discovered a hidden cache of ethylene glycol, industrial antifreeze, in the basement, alongside medical records detailing Tina's puzzling symptoms over the past 3 years. Later that afternoon, at Portland Police Headquarters, as Tina waited in the juvenile interview room, Detective Ross examined the child's hands, small and delicate, yet steady as they held a paper cup of water, and wondered how those hands could have measured out a lethal dose of the same poison that medical records suggested had been slowly accumulating in her own blood for years. The rain intensified as twilight approached, casting long shadows across the courthouse parking lot, where Detective Ross finally made her way to her vehicle, the weight of the day's events pressing down on her shoulders. In the 7 months since finding Amy Weldon's body, Ross had pieced together a narrative that defied the simple explanation presented by the prosecution, a narrative supported by evidence that Judge Thorne had systematically excluded from trial. The detective started her car, the windshield wipers struggling against the downpour, as she pulled away from the courthouse, knowing that the truth about the Weldon case was far more complex than the Portland media was reporting. Behind her, the courthouse lights glowed through the rain, the building now empty except for the cleaning staff and a single attorney still hunched over documents in the defense room, Julian Voss, already preparing the appeal that would eventually expose the full horrifying reality of what had transpired in that yellow house on S.E. Lexington Street. Detective Kira Ross's first formal interview with Tina Weldon was conducted in the Portland Police Bureau's special juvenile room, a space designed to be less intimidating with its pale blue walls and comfortable furniture, though nothing could soften the gravity of their conversation. "Can you tell me exactly what happened to your mother?" Ross asked gently, sitting across from Tina at the small table, while a child advocacy worker observed silently from the corner, the video camera recording every moment of this extraordinary encounter. Tina's response was delivered with unsettling precision, her small hands folded neatly in her lap as she described measuring 3 tablespoons of ethylene glycol into her mother's evening chamomile tea. Enough to cause rapid kidney failure, but not so much that she would taste the sweetness, the girl explained with clinical detachment. "I waited until she finished the whole cup before I went to my room to read, because the dosage calculations only work if you consume the full amount," Tina continued, her vocabulary jarringly sophisticated for a child her age, her blue eyes never wavering from the detective's increasingly troubled gaze. The interview continued for nearly 2 hours, with Tina answering each question with the same unnerving composure, describing how she had learned about antifreeze, poisoning from both internet research on the school Chromebook and from observing what she called my mother's methods. As the interview progressed, Ross carefully steered the conversation toward a critical question. Why? She was giving it to me too, but slower, Tina replied matter-of-factly, rolling up her sleeve to reveal a pattern of small bruises in the crook of her elbow. Sometimes in my food, but mostly she would tell me I needed my special medicine and give me injections that made me feel sick afterward. She said it was for my mitochondrial disease, but I don't have that. Across town, at the Multnomah County Medical Examiner's office, Dr. Eliza Chen was completing the preliminary autopsy on Amy Weldon, her findings adding a disturbing dimension to the case. The deceased has lethal levels of ethylene glycol in her system, consistent with acute poisoning, Dr. Chen dictated into her recorder, her gloved hands examining tissue samples under the bright laboratory lights. However, I'm also noting multiple indicators of long-term antifreeze exposure, including distinctive calcium oxalate crystals in the kidneys that suggest previous non-lethal doses were administered over time. This pattern is inconsistent with a single poisoning event. Meanwhile, the carefully constructed public persona of Amy Weldon was being celebrated in social media posts and impromptu memorials throughout Portland's close-knit Selwood neighborhood, where she had been known as a pillar of the community. Amy's Facebook page displayed years of posts chronicling Tina's supposed health struggles, hospital selfies showing Amy sleeping in chairs beside her daughter's bed, detailed updates about mysterious symptoms that baffled doctors, and grateful acknowledgments of the donations that poured in through the church's medical support fund, and a GoFundMe page titled Tina's Fight. Local news outlets ran stories featuring interviews with tearful church members who described Amy as the most devoted mother imaginable, someone who sacrificed everything for her sick daughter and never complained despite the incredible burden she carried. Within Amy's modest home, however, evidence told a different story as the Portland forensic team methodically processed the scene in the days following the murder. In Amy's bedroom, investigators discovered a locked box containing financial records that showed regular deposits from multiple crowdfunding platforms, disability benefit payments, and a life insurance policy on Tina taken out just 3 weeks before Amy's death. A policy with a double indemnity clause that would pay $1,000 if Tina died before her 12th birthday, from what the paperwork described as natural causes related to her ongoing medical condition. The beneficiary listed was not a family member or trust for Tina's care, but a man named Craig Vaughn, whose relationship to the Weldons was not immediately clear, though his phone number appeared repeatedly in Amy's call logs. The most damning evidence, however, came from Tina's school-issued Chromebook, recovered from her bedroom and analyzed by the Portland Police Bureau's digital forensics team. We found a draft email in the browser cache, never sent but automatically saved, explained tech specialist Maya Hernandez to Detective Ross 3 days after the murder, sliding a printout across the desk in the precinct's fluorescent-lit computer lab. It's addressed to an inmate at Riverbend Penitentiary, Marcus Weldon the father, and it's, well, you should read it yourself. The email, dated 3 days before Amy's death, would later become the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, with prosecutor Jason Walsh dramatically reading it aloud to the hushed Portland courtroom. "Dad, I found the bottles in the basement. The green one, like you said. She's been putting it in my chocolate milk. I did the math. She's given me 14 doses. I know what I have to do now." Digital timestamps showed the draft had been saved but never sent, with browser history indicating Tina had researched antifreeze poisoning symptoms immediately afterward, followed by searches on lethal dosages and methods of administering ethylene glycol without detection. As Detective Ross drove through Portland's rain-slick streets toward Riverbend Penitentiary to interview Marcus Weldon, the father's role in the tragedy remained unclear. Was he an unwitting confidant or something more sinister? The sprawling correctional facility, located 2 hours from Portland, housed Marcus Weldon as he served a 7-year sentence for wire fraud, his communications with his daughter limited to monitored visits and screened letters. I need to see all correspondence between Marcus Weldon and his daughter over the past year, Ross instructed the facility administrator, her intuition suggesting that the dynamics of this broken family were far more complex than they initially appeared. The prison's records revealed an interesting pattern. Letters exchanged monthly, each one seemingly innocent, discussing books Tina was reading, school projects, and Marcus's hopes for parole. Yet certain phrases appeared with odd frequency, and random words were occasionally underlined in pencil so faintly that they almost escaped notice. "We need a full analysis of these letters," Ross told her partner as they left the prison, the winter sunset already darkening the sky, though it was barely 4:30 p.m. "I think they were communicating in some kind of code." Back in Portland, the district attorney's office was building its case against Tina Weldon, focusing on the draft email as evidence of premeditation while dismissing the defense's early attempts to introduce medical records suggesting Amy had been poisoning her daughter for years. "We're charging her as a juvenile with special circumstances," District Attorney Eleanor Matthews announced to her team, her expression grave as she reviewed the case file in the glass-walled conference room of the Multnomah County Courthouse. "The evidence of premeditation is overwhelming, regardless of any mitigating factors. She researched the poison, calculated the dose, and administered it with full knowledge of the consequences." As news of the charges spread, Portland's community fractured along ideological lines. Those who saw Tina as a calculating killer despite her age, and those who believed she was a victim acting in desperate self-defense. The division played out in heated social media debates, on local talk radio, and in the letters pages of The Oregonian, while Tina herself remained in juvenile detention, separated from the adult population, but still isolated in a sterile room with a narrow bed and a small window that offered a glimpse of the Columbia River in the distance. During her second month of detention, Dr. Patricia Novak, the court-appointed psychologist, noted in her evaluation, "Subject shows minimal emotional response when discussing her mother's death or her own actions, but becomes noticeably agitated when the topic of her medical history arises. This pattern suggests complex trauma rather than antisocial tendencies." The preliminary hearing was held on a cold October morning, the Portland streets slick with fallen leaves, as Tina was escorted into the courthouse through a side entrance to avoid the growing media presence. Inside the courtroom, Judge Magnus Thorne presided with a stern demeanor that suggested his perspective before any evidence was presented, his reputation for harsh sentencing well known throughout Multnomah County. "The state will prove that this was a cold, calculated act of murder," Prosecutor Jason Walsh declared in his opening statement, his tall figure commanding attention at the center of the courtroom, his voice resonating with conviction. No matter her age, Tina Weldon researched her method, prepared her weapon, and executed her plan with precision that shows clear intent and awareness of her actions. The Portland Memorial Hospital security footage played on the courtroom's large monitor, the timestamp showing February 17, 2023, 4 months before Amy Weldon's death. As mother and daughter entered the emergency room, Amy's arm protectively around Tina's shoulders. The prosecution enters Exhibit 43, showing the defendant's 15th emergency room visit in a 3-year period, announced Prosecutor Walsh, standing beside the screen as the jury watched Amy speaking animatedly to the intake nurse gesturing toward Tina, who sat slumped in a wheelchair. Medical records from this visit show the defendant presenting with symptoms including dizziness, abdominal pain, and confusion, symptoms now known to be consistent with ethylene glycol poisoning. The footage continued, showing Amy producing a notebook from her purse and showing it to the doctor who had arrived to examine Tina, the mother's face a perfect mask of concern and exhaustion. Mrs. Weldon was a frequent visitor to Portland area hospitals, continued Walsh, advancing the presentation to show a compilation of security footage spanning back 3 years, each clip showing similar scenes of Amy rushing Tina into various emergency departments. The state will demonstrate that these hospital visits were part of an elaborate performance designed to portray Amy Weldon as a devoted mother caring for a chronically ill child, when in fact, medical tests now reveal the defendant was suffering from intentional poisoning, not by her mother, as the defense will claim, but self-administered to frame Mrs. Weldon and provide justification for the murder she was planning. The jurors' expressions ranged from confusion to horror as they watched the progression of footage showing a visibly deteriorating Tina growing thinner and more frail with each hospital visit, while Amy remained a constant, attentive presence at her side. Defense attorney Julian Voss watched the prosecution's presentation with barely contained frustration, his legal pad filled with notes and objections that Judge Thorne had already overruled during pre-trial motions. Voss was a veteran of Portland's legal community, known for taking difficult cases, but the Weldon trial was testing his usual unflappable demeanor. Your Honor, I must again move to introduce the medical records from Dr. Leora Prynne, which directly contradict the narrative being presented, Voss said, rising as soon as Walsh concluded his presentation, his voice steady despite his evident frustration. Dr. Prynne diagnosed Amy Weldon with Munchausen by proxy syndrome 5 years ago, and these records are essential to establishing the context of Tina's actions. Judge Magnus Thorne peered down from his bench, his expression severe beneath silver brows that matched his precisely trimmed beard. Mr. Voss, we have already addressed this in chambers. Dr. Prynne's records are inadmissible as they contain privileged therapeutic communications and unsubstantiated diagnostic opinions that Mrs. Weldon contested during her lifetime. The judge's ruling was delivered with finality that brooked no further argument, though several jurors exchanged puzzled glances, clearly curious about the excluded evidence. The jury will disregard the defense's reference to these alleged diagnoses, and Mr. Voss, I caution you against mentioning them again. The trial continued with the prosecution calling Dr. Matthew Sloan, the toxicologist who had analyzed samples from both Amy and Tina Weldon following the murder. The levels of ethylene glycol metabolites in Amy Weldon's system were acutely fatal, consistent with a single large dose administered shortly before death, Dr. Sloan testified, his academic precision lending weight to his words as he indicated charts displayed on the courtroom monitor. However, Tina Weldon's blood work showed a different pattern, lower levels, but with indicators of chronic exposure, including calcium oxalate crystals in the kidneys and distinctive damage to the nervous system that develops only with repeated exposure over time. In the gallery, Detective Kira Ross watched the proceedings with growing unease, aware that the jury was receiving only partial information despite the scientific testimony. During a recess, she approached Voss in the courthouse corridor, keeping her voice low as attorneys and spectators milled around them. The June 10th hospital records, 2 days before the murder, have you been able to get those admitted? She asked, referring to Tina's final emergency room visit before her mother's death. The blood work from that day is critical. It shows Tina had nearly lethal levels already in her system. Voss shook his head grimly, his tie slightly loosened after hours in the stuffy courtroom. Thorne blocked it on a technicality, chain of custody issues. since the samples were drawn for diagnostic purposes, not as evidence. The attorney glanced toward the courtroom doors, where bailiffs were preparing to readmit the public after the recess. This whole trial is a master class in selective evidence presentation. Walsh is painting Amy as Mother Teresa while burying anything that shows she was systematically poisoning her own child for years. As the trial resumed, the prosecution called Reverend Thomas Clark from Selwood Community Church, where Amy had been an active member and where many of her fundraising efforts for Tina's medical needs had been centered. Amy was the most devoted mother I've ever encountered, Reverend Clark testified, his kind face solemn as he recounted the many prayer services and fundraisers held for Tina. She worked tirelessly, often holding 2 jobs while still managing to be at every doctor's appointment, researching treatments, and keeping our congregation updated on Tina's condition. The Reverend described how the church had raised over $30,000 in the past 3 years for Tina's care. In addition to the successful GoFundMe campaigns that had garnered sympathy and support from across Portland and beyond. While the Reverend testified, Tina sat at the defense table, her expression unreadable, her small frame nearly lost, in the adult-sized chair. Unlike many child defendants who appeared bewildered or emotional in court, Tina's composure remained steady, her attention focused on each witness, occasionally writing notes to pass to her attorney. Portland child psychologist Dr. Patricia Novak, who had evaluated Tina during her pretrial detention, observed from the gallery, noting the girl's unusual affect, not the flat emptiness of a psychopath, as the prosecution had implied, but the hypervigilant control of a child who had learned that showing emotion could be dangerous. Mrs. Weldon would often bring Tina to church even when she was clearly unwell, Reverend Clark continued, his testimony painting a picture of maternal sacrifice that brought sympathetic murmurs from some jurors. There were times the child could barely walk, and Amy would carry her, refusing help because she said she was used to managing on her own. As the Reverend spoke, Prosecutor Walsh displayed photographs on the courtroom monitor showing Amy with her arm around a pale, thin Tina at various church functions, images that would later be revealed to have been taken within days of emergency room visits for symptoms that medical experts would eventually attribute to antifreeze poisoning. The afternoon session brought testimony from Tina's 5th-grade teacher at Selwood Elementary, Margaret Donovan, who described a bright but frequently absent student. Tina missed 47 days of the school year due to what her mother described as medical issues, Ms. Donovan testified, consulting her attendance records. When she was present, she was an exceptional student, particularly in science and mathematics, but often appeared tired and sometimes complained of stomach pain or headaches. During cross-examination, Voss attempted to establish a pattern that would support the defense's narrative. "Did Tina ever mention having to drink special medicine provided by her mother?" he asked, referring to the chocolate milk that investigators later determined had been used to mask the taste of antifreeze. Before the teacher could answer, Walsh was on his feet with an objection. "Calls for hearsay, Your Honor." Judge Thorne sustained the objection with a warning glance toward Voss, effectively blocking another avenue to introduce evidence of Amy's poisoning of her daughter. The day's final witness was Craig Vaughn, whose name had appeared as the beneficiary on Tina's life insurance policy, though Walsh carefully avoided mentioning this connection during direct examination. "Mr. Vaughn, what was your relationship with Amy Weldon?" the prosecutor asked, as the witness, a well-dressed man in his early 40s, settled into the witness stand. "We were friends through church, and I sometimes helped with fundraisers for Tina's medical expenses," Vaughn replied, his demeanor composed, though he avoided looking directly at Tina. Amy was a remarkable woman, completely devoted to her daughter despite the challenges. As Vaughn testified about Amy's character and dedication to Tina's care, Voss studied his notes for the coming cross-examination, planning questions that might reveal Vaughn's deeper connection to Amy without directly violating the judge's limitations. The relationship between Amy and Vaughn was more than the casual church acquaintance being portrayed. Phone records showed they had communicated almost daily for the past year, and financial transactions suggested he had received portions of the fundraising money supposedly dedicated to Tina's care. However, before Voss could begin his cross-examination, Judge Thorne announced the day's session was ending, scheduling Voss's questioning for the following morning, a tactical delay that would give Vaughn and the prosecution time to prepare. Outside the courthouse, a small group of protesters had gathered, some holding signs supporting Tina with messages like "Child victim, not criminal," and "Investigate Amy Weldon," while others demanded justice for the murdered mother. Local Portland news crews interviewed spectators exiting the courthouse, the case having captured public attention not just for its shocking nature, but for the complex ethical questions it raised about trying a child for murder when evidence suggested she might have been acting in self-defense against a mother who had been systematically poisoning her for years. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what you are about to hear is the most damning piece of evidence in this case, the defendant's own words, carefully crafted 3 days before she murdered her mother. Prosecutor Jason Walsh stood at the center of the Portland courtroom, holding a printed copy of the draft email recovered from Tina's school Chromebook, his expression grave, as he prepared for what would become the most dramatic moment of the trial. The courtroom was completely silent, the morning light filtering through the high windows, casting Walsh's tall figure in sharp relief as he adjusted his glasses and began to read. "Dad, I found the bottles in the basement. The green one, like you said." Walsh paused deliberately, allowing the first line to register with the jurors before continuing, his voice taking on a more ominous tone. "She's been putting it in my chocolate milk. I did the math. She's given me 14 doses. Another calculated pause as several jurors visibly reacted, exchanging glances or shifting uncomfortably in their seats. "I know what I have to do now." Walsh let the final sentence hang in the air, the simple declaration taking on a chilling significance in the context of Amy Weldon's death just 72 hours later. This email, drafted but never sent to the defendant's father in Riverbend Penitentiary, provides irrefutable evidence of premeditation, Walsh continued, now moving to stand directly in front of the jury box, establishing eye contact with several jurors. The digital forensics team has confirmed this was written exactly 3 days before Amy Weldon ingested a fatal dose of ethylene glycol, the same green substance referenced in this message, and the browser history immediately following this draft shows searches for antifreeze poisoning, fatal dose, and how to hide taste of ethylene glycol. From the defense table, Julian Voss watched the jurors' reactions closely, noting how effectively Walsh was using the email to construct a narrative of calculation and intent, while carefully avoiding any context that might support the defense's position that Tina was acting to protect herself. Beside Voss, Tina sat with the same composed demeanor she had maintained throughout the trial, though a careful observer might have noticed her hands, clasped tightly in her lap, the knuckles white with tension, betraying the effort this composure required. Walsh returned to the prosecution table and activated the courtroom display, showing a timeline that correlated Tina's internet searches with the draft email and ultimately with Amy's death. Following this email draft, the defendant methodically researched not only lethal doses, but methods of administration that would ensure her mother would not detect the poison. The timeline expanded to show search terms, timestamps, and visited websites, including medical journals and chemistry forums far beyond the typical browsing history of an 11-year-old. This is not the behavior of a confused or frightened child. This is the systematic research of someone planning a murder. The prosecutor then called Portland Police Digital Forensics Specialist Maya Hernandez to the stand to authenticate the evidence and explain how it had been recovered from the Chromebook. The browser history had been cleared, but the automatic backup system retained cached versions of the searches and the draft email, Hernandez explained, her technical expertise lending further credibility to the prosecution's exhibit. We were also able to recover deleted files showing that the defendant had downloaded and saved information about ethylene glycol poisoning, including scientific papers describing its effects on the kidneys and central nervous system. During cross-examination, Voss attempted to contextualize the evidence, asking Hernandez if the same browser history showed any searches related to Tina's own symptoms or medical condition. Yes, there were numerous searches about antifreeze poisoning symptoms, kidney damage, and neurological effects consistent with ethylene glycol exposure, Hernandez acknowledged. There were also searches for how to prove someone is poisoning you and Munchausen by proxy syndrome. Voss seized on this opening. So these searches could equally support the theory that Tina was researching what was happening to her own body, trying to understand why she was experiencing these symptoms, correct? Before Hernandez could answer, Walsh objected vehemently, and Judge Thorne sustained, instructing the witness not to speculate on the defendant's motivations for the searches and limiting the testimony to the factual evidence of what was found on the device. Following Hernandez, the prosecution called Dr. Eliza Chen from the Multnomah County Medical Examiner's Office to present the autopsy findings. Dr. Chen's testimony was clinical and precise as she described the manner of Amy Weldon's death. The cause of death was acute kidney failure resulting from ethylene glycol poisoning, with contributing factors of metabolic acidosis and central nervous system depression. She displayed autopsy photographs and tissue slides showing the distinctive calcium oxalate crystals formed in the kidneys when ethylene glycol breaks down in the body, explaining to the jury that the pattern indicated a single large dose rather than chronic exposure. As the medical testimony continued, several spectators in the gallery appeared distressed by the graphic nature of the evidence, though Tina's expression remained unchanged, her focus on Dr. Chen unwavering. In the back row of the gallery, Detective Kira Ross watched the proceedings with a deepening sense of unease, aware of critical medical evidence not being presented, particularly the blood tests from Portland Children's Hospital, showing Tina's own advanced ethylene glycol poisoning just 2 days before her mother's death. During the afternoon session, the prosecution presented physical evidence recovered from the Weldon home, the teacup containing residue of chamomile tea and ethylene glycol, the antifreeze bottle from the basement with Tina's fingerprints, and most damning, a metal ruler from Tina's school backpack that matched distinctive scratch marks on the plastic seal of the antifreeze container. The evidence clearly shows that the defendant used this ruler to pry open the child-proof cap of the poison container, Walsh explained, as the items were displayed to the jury, each sealed in clear evidence bags. This is not a bottle that was handled in passing or discovered accidentally. This is a container that was deliberately opened using a tool the defendant carried with her. The courtroom grew increasingly tense as Walsh called his final witness of the day, Dr. Samuel Hoffman, a toxicologist specializing in poisoning cases who had been brought in from Seattle to analyze the specific pattern of ethylene glycol poisoning in Amy Weldon's system. Based on the concentration and distribution of the toxin, I can state with medical certainty that Mrs. Weldon ingested approximately 3 tablespoons of ethylene glycol, most likely mixed into a hot liquid, which would have partially masked the sweet taste, Dr. Hoffman testified, his academic credentials lending weight to his conclusions. The timing of ingestion was approximately 8 to 10 hours before death, consistent with the prosecution's timeline of the evening tea ritual described by neighbors and documented in Mrs. Weldon's social media posts. As Dr. Hoffman detailed the progressive symptoms Amy would have experienced, nausea, vomiting, central nervous system effects, including slurred speech, and eventual unconsciousness, followed by metabolic acidosis and kidney failure, the gallery listened in horrified silence. The clinical description of Amy's suffering seemed designed to evoke sympathy for the victim and outrage toward the perpetrator, though Voss noted that Hoffman carefully avoided any mention of how these same symptoms would have manifested in a child experiencing long-term, lower-dose exposure. Exactly what the defense contended Tina had endured. When Voss's opportunity for cross-examination came, he immediately focused on this omission. Dr. Hoffman, in your review of this case, did you have access to Tina Weldon's medical records showing her blood work from June 10th, 2 days before her mother's death? The question was strategic, meant to highlight the evidence being withheld from the jury. I was provided with limited information about the defendant's medical history, Dr. Hoffman replied cautiously, glancing toward the prosecution table. Were you aware that Tina Weldon's blood work from Portland Children's Hospital showed elevated levels of ethylene glycol, consistent with ongoing exposure over a period of months, with a significant spike in the final samples taken on June 10th? Voss pressed, ignoring Walsh's rising objection. Judge Thorne's gavel came down sharply. Counselor, you are well aware this line of questioning references excluded evidence. The jury will disregard this question entirely. The judge's intervention only heightened the jury's awareness that significant information was being kept from them, with several jurors exchanging glances or frowning in apparent confusion about why relevant medical evidence would be excluded. As the day's session concluded, the prosecution had presented a compelling case of premeditated matricide supported by digital evidence, physical forensics, and expert testimony. Yet the defense had managed to plant seeds of doubt about the completeness of the narrative being presented. Outside the courthouse, the media coverage had intensified, with national news outlets now joining local Portland stations in reporting on the case. The unusual nature of the charges, a child facing adult-level murder charges for killing her mother, combined with the disturbing hints of Munchausen by proxy syndrome, had captured public attention far beyond Oregon. On the courthouse steps, opposing groups of protesters clashed verbally, some holding signs supporting justice for Amy, while others demanded medical records released and the truth about Munchausen. That evening, in the sparse visitors' room of the Juvenile Detention Center, where Tina had been held for the past 7 months, Julian Voss sat across from his young client, their conversation monitored but confidential under attorney-client privilege. Tomorrow we start presenting our case, Voss explained gently, noting the increasing fatigue visible in Tina's face after the grueling day in court. I need you to help me understand something. The email to your father about finding the green bottle. How did you know to look for it? For the first time since the trial began, Tina's composed facade cracked slightly, her voice dropping to a whisper as she leaned forward. The letters from Dad, they had codes in them. She glanced briefly at the guard stationed by the door before continuing. He would underline words, and if you put them together, they told me where to look. He knew Mr. Voss. He knew what she was doing to me. The Portland courtroom fell silent as Julian Voss rose to present the defense's opening statement. The morning light casting long rectangles across the wooden floor as he moved to stand before the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard the prosecution's version of events, a calculated murder planned by an 11-year-old child. Voss's voice was measured but resonant, his decades of courtroom experience evident in his confident stance and direct gaze. What you haven't heard, what the prosecution has systematically prevented you from hearing, is the complete story of what happened in the Weldon home over the past 3 years. Voss gestured toward Tina, seated at the defense table in a simple blue dress that emphasized her small stature and youth. The evidence we will present will show that Tina Weldon acted in self-defense after discovering that her mother had been slowly poisoning her with antifreeze for years as part of a condition known as Munchausen by proxy syndrome. Several jurors leaned forward slightly, clearly intrigued by this alternative narrative that had been hinted at but never fully articulated during the prosecution's case. More critically, we will demonstrate that in the days before Amy Weldon's death, Tina discovered not only the poison being used against her, but also a life insurance policy that would pay double if Tina died before her 12th birthday, revealing her mother's ultimate plan. Prosecutor Walsh immediately objected, rising to his feet with an expression of controlled outrage. "Your Honor, defense counsel is presenting speculation and introducing excluded evidence in his opening statement." Judge Thorne's response was swift and severe, his voice cutting through the courtroom. "Sustained. Mr. Voss, approach the bench." The following sidebar conference was tense, but hushed, with Thorne warning Voss against backdoor attempts to introduce inadmissible evidence and threatening sanctions if the defense continued this approach. When Voss returned to his opening statement, his strategy shifted to focus on the physical evidence already admitted, particularly the antifreeze bottle found in the basement with Tina's fingerprints. The prosecution has presented these fingerprints as evidence of guilt, but we will show they are actually evidence of discovery. The moment when an 11-year-old girl found the substance that had been making her sick for years. Voss emphasized that the same evidence could support two entirely different narratives, depending on the context in which it was viewed. When you examine Tina's actions through the lens of self-preservation rather than malice, the picture changes dramatically. The defense's first witness was Dr. Patricia Novak, the court-appointed child psychologist who had evaluated Tina during her detention. "In my professional assessment, Tina exhibits signs of complex trauma consistent with long-term abuse, not the antisocial patterns one would expect in a child who committed premeditated murder," Dr. Novak testified, her professional demeanor and credentials lending weight to her observations. Her emotional detachment, which the prosecution has characterized as callousness, is actually a common protective mechanism developed by children in chronically threatening environments. During cross-examination, Walsh attempted to undermine Novak's testimony by focusing on the limited time she had spent with Tina and suggesting her conclusions were speculative. "Doctor, isn't it true that the behaviors you've described could also be consistent with a child who lacks empathy and has calculated that appearing traumatized would benefit her case?" Walsh's questioning was aggressive, clearly intended to cast doubt on the psychological evaluation. "You've spent a total of 12 hours with the defendant. Is that really sufficient to make definitive judgments about her psychological state?" Dr. Novak remained composed, her responses measured but firm. While more time is always beneficial in psychological evaluations, 12 hours of clinical assessment is actually quite substantial and allowed for comprehensive testing and observation. She referred to her detailed notes as she continued, "The patterns I observed are consistent with trauma response, not performance. There are physiological markers of trauma that are extremely difficult to fake, particularly for a child, including autonomic nervous system responses when discussing certain topics." Following Dr. Novak, the defense called forensic toxicologist Dr. Rachel Martinez, who had independently analyzed the evidence samples provided to the defense. "The pattern of ethylene glycol residue found in the Weldon home tells a more complex story than the prosecution has presented," Dr. Martinez explained, displaying a diagram of the house with marked locations where trace amounts had been detected. We found evidence of the substance not only in the teacup and basement storage area, but also in the kitchen cabinet where Tina's special cups were kept, the ones used exclusively for her medical supplements, according to neighbor testimonies. Dr. Martinez's testimony directly challenged the prosecution's narrative, suggesting that the same poison used to kill Amy had been systematically administered to Tina over time. The residue patterns in Tina's personal cups showed repeated exposure, not a single contamination event, she explained, showing microscopic images of the crystalline residue patterns. Furthermore, the ruler recovered from Tina's backpack shows residue consistent with someone discovering and opening the poison container, not necessarily the person who had been regularly accessing it. During cross-examination, Walsh attacked Dr. Martinez's credibility, emphasizing that she had not been part of the original investigation and had only analyzed samples provided to the defense, not the complete evidence collection. "Isn't it true that your analysis is based on a limited subset of the evidence, Doctor?" Walsh asked pointedly. "And isn't it also true that you're being paid by the defense to testify here today?" Dr. Martinez remained unruffled by the implication. "I analyzed all samples made available to the defense through discovery, which should represent the relevant evidence collected by investigators." Her tone became slightly more assertive as she addressed the second question. "As for compensation, I'm being paid for my time as an expert witness, just as the prosecution's experts are. This is standard practice and doesn't influence my scientific conclusions, which are documented and reproducible." The afternoon session brought the most compelling defense witness yet, Dr. Elaine Winters, Tina's primary physician at Portland Children's Hospital, who had treated her for the mysterious recurring symptoms that had plagued her for years. Over a 3-year period, Tina presented with a constellation of symptoms that were puzzling in their inconsistency, sometimes neurological, sometimes gastrointestinal, occasionally affecting kidney function, Dr. Winters testified, referring to extensive medical charts projected on the courtroom display. What remained constant was that the symptoms typically worsened after time at home and improved during hospital stays, which is a red flag for potential Munchausen by proxy. As Dr. Winters began to discuss her growing concerns about Amy Weldon's behavior, including her resistance to certain tests and her unusual interest in more dramatic treatments, Walsh objected vigorously. "Your Honor, this testimony is speculative and prejudicial against the victim who cannot defend herself." Judge Thorne not only sustained the objection, but instructed Dr. Winters to limit her testimony to direct observations of Tina's medical condition without speculation about causes or Amy's behavior. Despite these limitations, Dr. Winters managed to convey critical information by focusing strictly on the medical facts. Blood samples taken from Tina on June 10th, 2 days before Amy Weldon's death, showed concerning levels of ethylene glycol metabolites at concentrations that would have become life-threatening within days if exposure continued. This testimony directly supported the defense's claim that Tina had been facing imminent danger, though Walsh objected to the characterization of life-threatening, forcing Dr. Winters to rephrase in more clinical terms. In a strategic move to humanize Tina and counter the prosecution's portrayal of her as calculating and emotionless, the defense called Tina's 5th-grade teacher, Margaret Donovan, back to the stand. Having previously testified for the prosecution about Tina's frequent absences, Donovan now spoke about the child's academic abilities and classroom behavior. Tina was exceptionally bright, particularly in science and mathematics, but she wasn't socially isolated or withdrawn, as some gifted children can be. Donovan's affection for her former student was evident as she continued. She was kind to other children, often helping classmates who struggled with lessons, and she showed particular compassion toward a student with physical disabilities in our class. Donovan's testimony included an anecdote that seemed particularly relevant given the circumstances. For our science fair last year, Tina created a project about household chemicals and their effects on living organisms. Her research was so thorough that I suggested she consider a career in medicine or toxicology. This information, while seemingly innocuous, helped explain Tina's sophisticated understanding of chemical properties that the prosecution had portrayed as evidence of calculated murder planning. The day's final defense witness was Portland police officer James Bennett, who had been first to arrive at the Weldon home after Tina's 911 call reporting her mother's condition. The defendant appeared unusually calm when I arrived, but this isn't uncommon in children experiencing shock, Officer Bennett testified, recalling the scene he encountered that morning. What struck me as unusual was her immediate statement that her mother had been poisoning her and that she had stopped it. This wasn't offered as an excuse or after questioning, but volunteered immediately, as though she believed she was reporting a crime rather than confessing to one. Bennett's testimony about Tina's demeanor and statements provided context for what the prosecution had characterized as cold-blooded admission of guilt. In my experience, perpetrators who plan crimes typically have prepared explanations or denials. They don't immediately offer incriminating statements unless they believe their actions were justified or necessary. Though Walsh objected to this characterization as speculative, Judge Thorne allowed the testimony as it fell within the officer's professional experience. As the day's proceedings drew to a close, Julian Voss requested permission to have Tina herself testify the following day, a high-risk strategy in any murder trial, but particularly complex given her age and the nature of the case. Judge Thorne appeared skeptical, ordering a special competency evaluation before ruling on whether Tina could take the stand in her own defense. The courtroom adjourned with this question unresolved, leaving spectators and media speculating about whether Portland would hear directly from the 11-year-old at the center of this extraordinary case. Outside the courthouse, public opinion continued to fragment, with increasing support for Tina as details of the potential Munchausen by proxy abuse emerged despite the judge's efforts to limit such evidence. Local Portland media ran special segments on the syndrome, interviewing experts who explained how parents with the condition systematically make their children ill for attention and financial gain, often becoming so skilled at deception that they can fool medical professionals for years. Meanwhile, Amy's supporters from Selwood Community Church maintained a vigil on the courthouse steps, their signs declaring "Justice for Amy" and "Don't believe the lies," creating a visual representation of the community divided by this tragic case. The sixth day of the Weldon trial began with an unexpected development that sent ripples through the Portland courtroom. Judge Magnus Thorne announced that Tina would not be permitted to testify in her own defense. After reviewing the psychological evaluation and considering the defendant's age, this court finds that testifying would not serve the interests of justice or the welfare of the minor, Thorne declared from the bench, his tone brooking no argument despite Julian Voss's visible frustration at the ruling. The decision effectively silenced Tina's first-person account of events, forcing the defense to rely on expert witnesses and circumstantial evidence to tell her story. Undeterred, Voss pivoted to what would become the most controversial evidence presentation of the trial, an attempt to introduce the life insurance policy Amy Weldon had taken out on her daughter just 3 weeks before her death. Your Honor, this document is central to establishing motive and context, Voss argued, holding the policy obtained through subpoena of Sentinel Life Insurance Company records. It demonstrates that Amy Weldon stood to benefit financially from Tina's death, particularly if it occurred before her 12th birthday, a fact directly relevant to the defendant's state of mind when she discovered this document. Prosecutor Jason Walsh was on his feet immediately, his objection forceful and prepared, suggesting he had anticipated this move. Your Honor, this policy is irrelevant to the charges against the defendant and serves only to prejudice the jury against the victim with unsubstantiated implications. Walsh's voice rose slightly as he continued, his tall figure imposing as he gestured emphatically. There is no evidence the defendant was aware of this policy at the time of the murder, making it completely immaterial to the question of her actions or motivations. Judge Thorne's ruling came swiftly, consistent with his previous pattern of excluding evidence that supported the defense's narrative of Tina as a victim rather than a calculated killer. The insurance policy is excluded as irrelevant and potentially prejudicial. The jury will not hear testimony regarding this document. The judge's decision elicited audible reactions from the gallery, including a sharp intake of breath from Detective Kira Ross, who had discovered the policy during her investigation and recognized its significance to understanding the family dynamics. Voss, clearly prepared for this ruling, immediately shifted to his alternative strategy, calling Marcus Weldon, Tina's father, to testify via video link from Riverbend Penitentiary. The courtroom's atmosphere tensed noticeably as the large monitor was positioned to display Marcus Weldon's face, his prison jumpsuit, visible as he sat in a small conference room at the correctional facility, a guard standing just out of frame. "Mr. Weldon, when did you begin to suspect that your ex-wife was making your daughter ill?" Voss asked directly, establishing the central question before Walsh could object. Marcus Weldon's face remained composed, though his eyes reflected a mixture of anger and grief as he answered. "It started about 3 years ago during my monthly video calls with Tina. I noticed she looked increasingly sick each time, but the symptoms seemed to change. Sometimes she'd be disoriented, sometimes physically ill." His voice grew slightly hoarse as he continued, "Amy always had elaborate explanations, rare conditions the doctors were investigating, but something felt wrong about how she almost enjoyed the attention from Tina's illnesses." Walsh objected immediately, arguing that Marcus Weldon's observations were speculative and prejudicial. But Judge Thorne, surprisingly, allowed the testimony to continue, perhaps recognizing that completely excluding the father's perspective would create obvious grounds for appeal. Marcus described how his suspicions grew after researching his daughter's reported symptoms during his limited internet access in prison, eventually leading him to information about Munchausen by proxy syndrome. "I couldn't directly accuse Amy. She'd have cut off my contact with Tina completely, so I began trying to warn my daughter in ways that wouldn't be obvious to Amy when she screened our communications." When Voss asked about the coded messages in his letters, Marcus explained the system he had developed, using underlined words that, when read in sequence, conveyed hidden messages. "I told her to look for anything unusual in the house, particularly in places Amy thought were private. That's how I guided her to check the basement storage area where household chemicals would be kept." As he spoke, the prosecution team could be seen conferring urgently, clearly concerned about the impact of this testimony that connected directly to the draft email central to their case. "And what specifically made you suspect poisoning rather than some other form of Munchausen by proxy?" Voss asked, carefully leading the testimony toward the crucial element of ethylene glycol. Marcus's answer was direct and devastating. "Amy's father was a mechanic. I remembered seeing containers of antifreeze in their garage growing up, and she once mentioned how her father warned her about its sweetness being dangerous to pets. When Tina's symptoms matched antifreeze poisoning, the confusion, the kidney problems, I became convinced that's what was happening." Walsh's cross-examination of Marcus Weldon was aggressive, focusing on his criminal conviction for wire fraud and suggesting his testimony was motivated by guilt over his absence from his daughter's life. "Isn't it convenient, Mr. Weldon, that you've constructed this narrative where your secretly helping your daughter from prison rather than admitting you abandoned her to a situation you now claim was dangerous. The prosecutor's tone was cutting, clearly intended to undermine Marcus's credibility with the jury. Marcus remained steady under the hostile questioning, his responses measured rather than defensive. I made serious mistakes that put me in prison and away from my daughter when she needed protection. That's something I'll live with forever. His direct gaze at Walsh conveyed sincerity as he continued, but that doesn't change what was happening to Tina or my efforts to help her from the only position I had. Following Marcus Weldon's testimony, the defense called Dr. Leora Prynne, the therapist who had treated Amy Weldon 5 years earlier and who had attempted to intervene during Tina's sentencing. Despite Judge Thorne's previous rulings excluding her diagnostic records, Voss had found a narrow path to introduce limited testimony based on observable behaviors rather than privileged communications. Dr. Prynne, based solely on your professional observations of Amy Weldon's behavior patterns during sessions you observed, not private communications, did you witness concerning interactions between Amy and her daughter? Voss asked, carefully framing the question to avoid the therapy privilege issues. Dr. Prynne, a slight woman with a serious demeanor enhanced by wire-rimmed glasses, chose her words with precision, clearly aware of the legal constraints. I observed Amy consistently interrupting Tina when she attempted to describe her symptoms, redirecting the narrative to emphasize their severity in ways Tina herself had not. The therapist's professional detachment did not completely mask her obvious concern as she continued, I also noted that Amy maintained a detailed log of Tina's episodes that included photographs and videos, which is a documented behavior pattern in cases of medical child abuse. Walsh objected repeatedly during Dr. Prynne's testimony, winning some limitations but unable to completely block her professional observations from reaching the jury. The strategic importance of her testimony became clear when she described her actions after growing concerned. Based on my observations, I contacted Portland Child Protective Services with a mandatory report expressing concern about potential medical child abuse. This statement directly contradicted the prosecution's narrative that no one had ever questioned Amy's care of Tina prior to the murder. The afternoon session brought a dramatic confrontation when the defense attempted to introduce hospital records showing elevated levels of ethylene glycol in Tina's blood from samples taken 2 days before Amy's death. Your Honor, these medical records are directly relevant to establishing that Tina Weldon was acting in self-defense against imminent threat to her life, Voss argued, holding the sealed records obtained through subpoena from Portland Children's Hospital. The June 10th blood work shows near-fatal levels of ethylene glycol, proving that Tina was literally days away from being killed by the same poison she later used against her mother. Judge Thorne's ruling was consistent with his pattern throughout the trial. The medical records are excluded on grounds previously established in chambers. His tone grew sharper as he continued, Mr. Voss, the court has ruled multiple times on this category of evidence. Continued attempts to introduce it border on contempt. The gallery reacted with murmurs of disbelief, several journalists scribbling notes about the excluded evidence that would later feature prominently in coverage, questioning the fairness of the proceedings. With direct evidence of Tina's poisoning largely blocked by judicial rulings, Voss shifted to his final witness, forensic accountant Melissa Chen, who had analyzed the Weldon family finances and the flow of funds from various sources. My investigation revealed that approximately $218,000 had been raised through various crowdfunding campaigns, church donations, and disability benefits over the 3-year period of Tina's reported illnesses, Chen testified, displaying charts showing the financial timeline. However, only approximately 30% of these funds were spent on medical-related expenses, The remainder went to personal spending, including vacation properties, luxury items, and transfers to an account held jointly with Craig Vaughn. This testimony directly challenged the prosecution's portrayal of Amy as a selfless mother sacrificing everything for her sick child, suggesting instead a financial motive for maintaining the illness narrative. Walsh objected to this characterization, but Chen's testimony was admitted as factual financial analysis rather than speculation about motives. As the financial records were displayed on the courtroom monitor, jurors could clearly see the pattern of fundraising coinciding with Tina's hospital visits, followed by spending unrelated to medical care. As the defense case neared conclusion, Voss made one final attempt to introduce the excluded evidence through a different approach, requesting a directed verdict based on the totality of evidence, including that which had been kept from the jury. Your Honor, when all evidence is considered, including the June 10th medical records showing Tina had lethal levels of antifreeze in her system, the insurance policy with the double indemnity clause, and Dr. Prin's full diagnosis of Munchausen by proxy, it becomes clear that Tina Weldon acted in necessary self-defense against imminent danger to her life. Judge Thorne not only denied the motion, but admonished Voss for attempting to place excluded evidence in the record through procedural means. The judge's increasingly hostile tone toward the defense was noted by several legal observers in the gallery, with one Portland Law School professor whispering to a colleague that Thorne was creating a perfect record for appeal. As the day's session concluded, the defense rested its case, having presented a narrative of self-defense hampered at every turn by evidentiary rulings that kept key elements from the jury's consideration. The tension in the courtroom had reached a palpable level, with clear divisions among spectators reflecting the broader public debate happening outside. Some viewed Tina as a calculating killer being appropriately prosecuted, while others saw her as a victim of both her mother's abuse and now a legal system that seemed determined to punish rather than protect her. In the juvenile detention center that evening, Tina sat across from Julian Voss during their final pre-verdict consultation, her composure finally showing cracks as the reality of her situation settled in. "They're not going to believe me, are they?" she asked quietly, the simple question carrying the weight of a child's recognition that adult systems sometimes fail those they're meant to protect. The 7th day of the Weldon trial dawned with a somber atmosphere hanging over the Portland courthouse, rain streaming down the windows as spectators and media filed through security checkpoints. Inside courtroom 3, Julian Voss sat beside Tina at the defense table, reviewing his notes for closing arguments, while his young client maintained the composed demeanor that had become her courtroom signature, though the dark circles under her eyes revealed the toll of the trial. "The jury will see through the prosecution's selective presentation," Voss assured Tina quietly, though his expression suggested less confidence than his words conveyed. Prosecutor Jason Walsh delivered his closing argument with the polished intensity that had characterized his approach throughout the trial, his tall figure commanding the jury's attention as he systematically reinforced the narrative of premeditated murder. "Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence before you is clear and compelling," Walsh began, standing directly before the jury box without notes, his voice resonating through the crowded courtroom. Tina Weldon researched antifreeze poisoning, drafted a message detailing her intentions, calculated the lethal dose, and administered it to her mother with full knowledge of the consequences. These are not the actions of a child acting in confusion or fear, but of a calculating individual who decided to end her mother's life. Walsh methodically reviewed the prosecution's evidence. The draft email to Marcus Weldon, the browser history showing research on lethal doses, the fingerprints on the antifreeze bottle, and the ruler used to open it found in Tina's backpack. The defense has attempted to distract you with speculative theories and attacks on Amy Weldon's character, a devoted mother who can no longer defend herself. His voice lowered dramatically as he continued, "They want you to believe that an accomplished, dedicated parent who spent years seeking medical care for her daughter was secretly poisoning her. A convenient story that lacks any credible evidence actually presented in this courtroom." This characterization drew a barely perceptible reaction from several jurors who had clearly noticed the judge's repeated exclusion of medical evidence, though Walsh quickly refocused their attention on the prosecution's timeline of the murder. On the evening of June 11, 2023, Amy Weldon enjoyed her nightly cup of chamomile tea, a routine her daughter was well aware of and exploited to deliver a lethal dose of ethylene glycol. Walsh's description of Amy's suffering as the poison took effect was detailed and emotive, clearly intended to generate sympathy for the victim and outrage toward the perpetrator. She died alone, in pain, betrayed by the child she had devoted her life to raising. When Julian Voss rose for the defense's closing argument, his approach contrasted sharply with Walsh's emotional appeal, focusing instead on the gaps and inconsistencies in the prosecution's case. The state has presented you with a partial story, carefully edited to support their preferred narrative while systematically excluding evidence that would explain why an 11-year-old child might take such desperate action. Voss moved to stand beside Tina, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder as he addressed the jury directly. "What you haven't been allowed to hear is that Tina Weldon had lethal levels of antifreeze in her own blood just 2 days before her mother's death, the same poison administered by the same person who stood to collect $1 million insurance payout if Tina died before her 12th birthday." Walsh immediately objected, citing the previous exclusion of this evidence, and Judge Thorne not only sustained but delivered a sharp rebuke. "Mr. Voss, you are well aware that references to excluded evidence are inappropriate in closing arguments. The jury will disregard these statements entirely." Despite this setback, Voss continued his methodical deconstruction of the prosecution's case, reframing each piece of evidence to support the defense's narrative of self-preservation rather than malice. Tina's fingerprints on the antifreeze bottle aren't evidence of her administering the poison. They're evidence of her discovering what was being used against her. Voss gestured toward the evidence photos displayed on the courtroom monitor, highlighting the pattern of smudges that suggested examination rather than regular use. Her research into antifreeze poisoning wasn't preparation for murder. It was a desperate attempt to understand what was happening to her own body as she grew increasingly ill from the same substance later found in her mother's tea. As Voss concluded his argument, he returned to the core question before the jury. What would make an 11-year-old honor student with no history of behavior problems take such drastic action? The answer lies in the evidence you haven't been permitted to fully consider: a child acting to save her own life when all other avenues of protection had failed. His final words were delivered with quiet intensity that contrasted with Walsh's more theatrical style. Tina Weldon didn't wake up one morning and decide to become a killer. She woke up and realized she would become a victim if she didn't act. Judge Thorne's instructions to the jury were detailed and technical, emphasizing the legal standards for first-degree murder and the state's burden of proof, with notably brief mention of potential mitigating factors or self-defense considerations. "You must base your verdict solely on the evidence properly admitted in this courtroom," Thorne emphasized, his tone carrying subtle emphasis on "properly admitted" that seemed directed at Voss's references to excluded evidence. Speculation about matters not in evidence has no place in your deliberations. As the jury filed out to begin deliberations at 11:42 a.m., the courtroom remained tense, with legal analysts in the gallery already discussing the likelihood of appeal regardless of the outcome. Tina was escorted to a private room to wait, while the attorneys, spectators, and media settled in for what most expected to be a lengthy deliberation process, given the case's complexity and the child defendant's unique circumstances. The surprising speed with which the jury reached their decision sent a ripple of shock through the courthouse when the announcement came just 4 hours later. A verdict had been reached. As the jurors filed back into the courtroom, their expressions were somber, several avoiding looking directly at Tina as they took their seats. The court clerk accepted the verdict form from the forewoman, a middle-aged woman with a tight expression, and handed it to Judge Thorne, who reviewed it briefly before returning it for the formal reading. In the case of State of Oregon versus Tina Grace Weldon on the charge of murder in the first degree, we the jury find the defendant. The clerk's pause seemed to extend for an eternity, the courtroom collectively holding its breath. Guilty. The single word fell like a physical weight in the silent room, followed by a mixture of gasps and murmurs from the gallery, though Tina herself showed no visible reaction beyond a slight stiffening of her shoulders. The Portland media's coverage of the verdict was immediate and polarized, with television crews broadcasting live from the courthouse steps as opposing groups of protesters reacted to the news. Child killer convicted, justice for Amy Weldon, declared the Oregonian's website headline, while Portland Progressive posted, "System fails child victim. Crucial evidence excluded in Weldon trial," within minutes of the verdict's announcement. The hashtag Justice for Tina began trending locally, competing with Justice for Amy as the city's residents took sides in what had become Portland's most divisive criminal case in recent memory. In the days following the verdict, as sentencing preparations began, Julian Voss filed a series of emergency motions challenging the trial's fairness and seeking to introduce new evidence before sentencing. Your Honor, we have obtained hospital records through additional subpoenas that prove conclusively that Tina Weldon was suffering from ethylene glycol poisoning at levels that would have been fatal within days, Voss argued in Judge Thorne's chambers, joined by the prosecution team and court reporters. Furthermore, we've located a witness, Henrik Voss, no relation to counsel, who observed Amy Weldon forcing Tina to consume what she called special medicine on multiple occasions. Judge Thorne's rejection of these motions was swift and definitive, his ruling citing procedural timing and relevance issues, rather than addressing the substance of the new evidence. These matters should have been raised during the discovery phase, not after a jury has rendered its verdict, Thorne declared, his tone suggesting impatience with what he characterized as defense delay tactics. The sentencing hearing will proceed as scheduled on Friday morning. The sentencing preparations coincided with growing public awareness of the evidence that had been excluded from trial, as legal analysts and child welfare advocates discussed the case on local Portland radio and television programs. Dr. Leora Prynne gave an interview to the Portland Tribune, carefully avoiding discussion of confidential therapy sessions, but explaining the general patterns of Munchausen by proxy syndrome and revealing that she had filed a formal complaint with the Oregon Medical Board regarding her concerns about Amy Weldon's treatment of Tina years before the murder. Detective Kira Ross found herself increasingly troubled by the case's outcome, the conflict between her professional obligations and personal concerns evident in her reluctance to participate in the district attorney's press conference following the verdict. "This isn't the justice I became a police officer to serve," she confided to her partner as they left the courthouse after testifying in an unrelated case. "That child was fighting for her life, and now we're going to lock her up instead of getting her the help she needs." On the evening before sentencing, Julian Voss made one final attempt to introduce the critical medical evidence, filing an emergency petition with the Oregon Court of Appeals citing manifest injustice and violation of due process rights in Judge Thorne's exclusion of Tina's medical records. The petition included affidavits from 3 medical experts who had reviewed the June 10th blood work and concluded unanimously that Tina had been within days of kidney failure due to ethylene glycol poisoning at the time of her mother's death. The appeals court's response was procedurally correct but devastating to the defense. While the petition raises concerning issues regarding evidence exclusion, the appropriate remedy is post-conviction appeal rather than emergency intervention in the sentencing phase. With this final avenue closed, Tina Weldon's fate now rested entirely with Judge Magnus Thorne, whose pattern of rulings throughout the trial had consistently favored the prosecution's narrative and excluded evidence of Tina's victimization. In the juvenile detention center the night before sentencing, Tina sat with Julian Voss in the small visitation room, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across her pale face. "What's going to happen tomorrow?" she asked, her voice smaller and more childlike than it had been throughout the trial, the first real crack in her carefully maintained composure. "Judge Thorne doesn't believe me, does he?" Voss's attempt at reassurance felt hollow even as he spoke the words, knowing that Oregon's juvenile sentencing guidelines still allowed for significant discretion and that Thorne had consistently taken the harshest position available throughout the proceedings. "We still have the appeals process, Tina. This isn't over, even after tomorrow?" As Portland prepared for the sentencing hearing the next morning, national media had begun to take notice of the case, with several major networks sending correspondents to cover what was being described as an unprecedented situation. An 11-year-old girl facing sentencing for the premeditated murder of her mother, with significant questions about whether she had been the victim of systematic poisoning herself. Outside the courthouse, the rain had finally stopped, but dark clouds hung low over the city skyline, mirroring the somber mood of those gathering to witness the final act in this tragic Portland drama. The sentencing hearing for Tina Grace Weldon began at precisely 9 a.m. in a Portland courtroom so packed that court officers had to turn away dozens of spectators, creating a restless overflow crowd in the courthouse corridors. The morning light filtered weakly through the high windows, casting Judge Magnus Thorne's bench in dramatic shadow as he entered, and the bailiff called for all to rise, the rustle of movement accompanied by a tense silence. Tina sat beside Julian Voss at the defense table, wearing a simple gray dress that seemed to emphasize her youth and vulnerability, her blonde hair pulled back with a navy blue headband that matched the small ribbon on her collar, the first visible sign of any personal touch in her otherwise institutional courthouse appearances. The proceedings began with victim impact statements from Amy Weldon's church community, a procession of tearful testimonials about the devoted mother they had known and the devastating impact of her death. "Amy was the most selfless person I've ever met," declared Reverend Thomas Clark, his voice breaking slightly as he addressed the court from the witness stand, occasionally glancing toward Tina with an expression of mingled pity and incomprehension. She dedicated her life to caring for her chronically ill daughter, working multiple jobs to afford treatments, organizing fundraisers when medical bills overwhelmed her, and never once complaining about the burden she carried. Each speaker reinforced the image of Amy as a martyred mother, their statements clearly designed to influence Judge Thorne toward maximum sentencing, though none directly addressed what punishment they believed appropriate for an 11-year-old convicted of murder. Amy would stay up all night researching rare conditions, taking meticulous notes on Tina's symptoms to share with specialists, and driving as far as Seattle to get consultations with experts, testified Sharon Norris, the Weldons' next-door neighbor, her hands clutching a tissue as she spoke. The idea that this devoted mother was somehow harming her child is an abominable lie, a desperate attempt to justify an unforgivable act. Throughout these testimonials, Tina remained still and expressionless, her gaze fixed straight ahead rather than on the speakers, her small hands folded neatly in her lap, in a posture that had become familiar during the trial. Julian Voss occasionally leaned over to whisper something to his young client, but her responses, if any, were imperceptible to observers. The prosecution team, led by Jason Walsh, sat with composed satisfaction, their case having prevailed despite the defense's attempts to introduce evidence of Munchausen by proxy and Tina's own poisoning. As the victim's statements concluded, the courtroom atmosphere shifted noticeably when court officers opened the side door, admitting a shackled prisoner in an orange jumpsuit, Marcus Weldon, Tina's father, brought from Riverbend Penitentiary to make a statement before sentencing. His unexpected physical presence, rather than appearing via video link as during the trial, created a murmur of surprise throughout the gallery. "Your Honor, I requested to be here in person because what I have to say needs to be heard directly, not filtered through a screen," Marcus began, his voice steady despite the visible emotion in his eyes as he looked at his daughter for the first time in months. "I failed to protect my child when she needed me most," Marcus continued, the raw honesty in his voice commanding complete silence in the courtroom. "I knew something was wrong in that house. I knew Amy was making Tina sick, but from prison, all I could do was try to help Tina understand what was happening to her." He described the coded messages in his letters, explaining how he had tried to guide Tina to evidence of her mother's actions without explicitly accusing Amy, fearing that would result in his complete isolation from his daughter. "I told her where to look for the poison, how to document what was happening, how to protect herself, but I never imagined it would end this way." Prosecutor Walsh objected repeatedly during Marcus's statement, arguing that he was introducing unsubstantiated allegations against the victim and attempting to relitigate the case after verdict. But Judge Thorne allowed the testimony to continue, perhaps recognizing that a complete record was necessary, given the inevitable appeals to come. Marcus described his growing horror as Tina's condition deteriorated during their monitored video calls, the pattern of symptoms matching what his research in the prison library had revealed about antifreeze poisoning. "I was trapped, watching my daughter being slowly killed, with no one believing that the perfect mother everyone admired was actually the one making her sick." When Marcus finished speaking, the courtroom remained unnaturally quiet, the impact of his testimony creating a palpable shift in the atmosphere, even among those who had been most convinced of Tina's calculated guilt. Judge Thorne called a brief recess before the defense's formal sentencing presentation, during which journalists rushed to file updates and spectators debated in hushed tones in the courthouse hallways. The case that had seemed settled with the guilty verdict was once again provoking questions and uncertainty, particularly as Marcus Weldon's testimony connected directly to the draft email that had been central to the prosecution's case. When court reconvened, Julian Voss rose to make his sentencing recommendations, his approach focusing on Tina's age, lack of prior behavioral issues, and the exceptional circumstances surrounding the case. "Your Honor, regardless of the verdict, we are dealing with an 11-year-old child whose actions, if they occurred as charged, happened in a context of extreme psychological distress and perceived threat." Voss carefully avoided directly challenging the jury's finding while emphasizing factors that should mitigate punishment. Supreme Court precedent in Miller v. Alabama and Montgomery v. Louisiana clearly establishes that mandatory life sentences for juvenile offenders constitute cruel and unusual punishment, recognizing the fundamental differences between adult and adolescent brain development, decision-making capacity, and potential for rehabilitation. Voss introduced testimony from Dr. Elizabeth Morgan, a leading child psychiatrist who had evaluated Tina during detention, who explained the developmental considerations relevant to sentencing. At 11 years old, the prefrontal cortex responsible for impulse control, risk assessment, and understanding long-term consequences, is still profoundly underdeveloped, Dr. Morgan testified, citing neurological research with visual aids displaying adolescent brain development. Even if the court accepts that Tina understood the immediate outcome of her actions, her neurological capacity to fully comprehend the moral and legal implications was biologically limited by her developmental stage. The defense presentation continued with a proposed rehabilitation plan developed in consultation with juvenile justice specialists that would place Tina in a secure therapeutic facility with intensive psychological treatment rather than a traditional incarceration setting. This case presents an opportunity to demonstrate that our justice system can respond appropriately to juvenile offenders, particularly those who have experienced trauma, Voss argued, his passion for the proposal evident in his voice and gestures. Tina needs intervention and healing, not warehousing in a system designed for adult offenders. When Prosecutor Walsh rose for the state's sentencing recommendation, his tone was markedly harsher than during the trial itself, perhaps responding to the growing public sympathy for Tina following Marcus Weldon's testimony. Your Honor, let us not forget what actually happened here, a premeditated murder carefully planned and executed by a defendant who, regardless of her age, demonstrated clear understanding of her actions. Walsh's recommendation was direct and uncompromising. The state recommends the maximum sentence permitted under Oregon juvenile law for homicide, incarceration in a juvenile facility until age 21, followed by transfer to adult corrections to serve the remainder of a 25-year minimum sentence before parole eligibility. The prosecutor emphasized public safety and deterrence in justifying the severe recommendation. This was not an impulsive act or a momentary lapse in judgment. This was calculated murder carried out over days of planning, demonstrating a level of premeditation that demands significant consequences regardless of the defendant's age. Walsh dismissed the defense's rehabilitation proposal as inadequate to address the severity of the crime and sending a dangerous message that age alone can excuse even the most serious offenses. Before delivering his sentence, Judge Thorne offered Tina the opportunity to address the court, a standard procedural step, though unusual with such a young defendant. After a brief, whispered consultation with Voss, Tina rose slowly from her seat, her small stature making the gesture seem particularly poignant as she faced the judge. "I didn't want to hurt anyone," she said, her voice soft but clear in the hushed courtroom, the first words many spectators had heard directly from her. "I just didn't want to die from the medicine she was giving me." The simplicity of her statement, delivered without the rehearsed quality one might expect, created a profound silence in the courtroom, broken only when Judge Thorne cleared his throat and began to speak. "The court has considered all factors relevant to sentencing, including the defendant's age, the circumstances of the crime, and the recommendations from both prosecution and defense." Thorne's expression remained impassive as he continued, giving no indication of which way he was leaning as he reviewed the case details and applicable legal standards. While the defendant's youth is certainly a mitigating factor, the premeditated nature of the offense cannot be overlooked. As Thorne approached his actual sentencing declaration, the tension in the courtroom became almost unbearable. Journalists poised with pens and digital recorders, spectators leaning forward in their seats, and Tina standing motionless beside her attorney, awaiting the words that would determine her future. In balancing the interests of justice, public safety, and the unique circumstances of this case, I must consider not only what is appropriate for an 11-year-old defendant, but also the message this court sends about the sanctity of human life and the consequences of taking it, regardless of one's age. The judge's preamble suggested he was leading toward a compromise sentence, perhaps the supervised therapeutic option proposed by the defense. What happened next would become the most controversial judicial pronouncement in Portland's recent history, sending shockwaves through the legal community and igniting a national debate on juvenile justice. Judge Magnus Thorne's expression hardened as he leaned forward, his voice rising in both volume and intensity. For the premeditated murder of Amy Corrine Weldon, this court sentences you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. A gasp rippled through the courtroom, but Thorne continued before anyone could fully process his words. You have committed the most unnatural of crimes, the murder of the very person who gave you life, and it is the judgment of this court that you will die in prison for this matricide. The statement was so extreme and so clearly unconstitutional under established Supreme Court precedent prohibiting life without parole for juveniles that even Prosecutor Walsh appeared shocked, exchanging puzzled glances with his team as the judge continued his sentencing speech. Julian Voss was immediately on his feet. Your Honor, with all due respect, this sentence directly contradicts Miller v. Alabama and is unconstitutional on its face. Thorne acknowledged the objection with a dismissive wave. Your objection is noted for the record, Mr. Voss. The severity of this crime warrants extraordinary measures. As the implications of Thorne's sentence registered throughout the courtroom, a commotion erupted in the gallery. Dr. Leora Prynne, Amy's former therapist, who had attempted to intervene at earlier stages of the case, stood up and called out, "This is a miscarriage of justice. I diagnosed Amy Weldon with Munchausen by proxy 5 years ago and filed reports that were ignored." Court officers moved quickly to remove her, but her words had been heard by everyone present, including journalists who immediately began filing updates on this dramatic development. In the chaos that followed, Tina remained standing, her expression unchanged despite the extraordinary pronouncement that she would die in prison, a phrase Judge Thorne had deliberately chosen for its shock value and media appeal. As the bailiff approached to take her into custody, Julian Voss placed a protective arm around his young client's shoulders, already dictating emergency appeal points to his associate, even as television cameras outside captured the first crowds gathering in reaction to the news of the sentence that would soon go viral across the nation. Judge Magnus Thorne's sentencing chambers were located on the 3rd floor of the Portland Courthouse, a wood-paneled room with views of the Willamette River that normally offered a tranquil setting for the judge's deliberations. On this morning, however, the atmosphere was anything but peaceful, as Thorne met with his law clerk, Miranda Jenkins, to prepare the written sentencing order that would formalize his controversial decision in the Weldon case. Your sentencing statement has already been picked up by national media, Your Honor, Jenkins reported, her expression carefully neutral, though her concern was evident in her tone. The phrase "die in prison" is trending on social media, and legal analysts are unanimously calling the sentence unconstitutional. Thorne appeared unmoved by this information, adjusting his reading glasses as he reviewed the draft order on his computer screen. The appellate court will do its job, and I've done mine. Sometimes it takes an extraordinary case to prompt reconsideration of established precedent. His casual dismissal of the constitutional issues revealed a calculated strategy behind what had appeared to be an emotional outburst in court. Thorne had deliberately imposed a sentence he knew would be overturned, creating a media firestorm that would bring attention to his long-held belief that juvenile murderers should face adult consequences regardless of age or circumstances. Make sure the order emphasizes the premeditated nature of the crime and the defendant's clear understanding of her actions. That's what the media will quote. Meanwhile, in the small conference room of the Juvenile Detention Center, Tina sat across from Julian Voss as he explained the appeals process and the certainty that Judge Thorne's sentence would be reversed. The Supreme Court has been very clear that life without parole cannot be imposed on juvenile offenders, especially those under 14. Voss explained gently, trying to reassure his young client without minimizing the seriousness of their situation. Judge Thorne knows this. He imposed this sentence knowing it will create headlines, but cannot legally stand. Tina's response revealed a maturity and insight that continued to surprise even those who had worked closely with her throughout the case. "He wants people to be angry about me getting out someday." Her perception was accurate. Thorne's strategy was precisely to generate public outrage over the inevitable reduction of her sentence, potentially influencing future legislation on juvenile sentencing. "Dr. Novak says people will believe I'm a monster no matter what the truth is," Tina continued, referring to the child psychologist who had been working with her. During detention, her small fingers methodically folding the edge of a paper napkin as she spoke. "She says some people need to believe bad things only happen because of monsters, not because regular people can do terrible things too." Across Portland, reaction to the sentence was swift and polarized, with protests forming on the courthouse steps within hours of the pronouncement. "Justice for Tina," read signs held by child welfare advocates and juvenile justice reformers, while a smaller contingent of Amy Weldon's supporters countered with "Remember the Victim" placards. Local news crews captured the growing crowds as the afternoon progressed, their coverage emphasizing the unprecedented nature of the sentence and the legal controversy it had generated. "Judge Thorne has essentially issued a death sentence to an 11-year-old girl," declared Professor Eleanor Franklin of Portland Law School in an interview with KPTV. "This violates not only established Supreme Court precedent, but basic principles of proportional justice in a civilized society." The viral nature of the case escalated when national news organizations picked up the story, with the phrase, "You will die in prison," becoming the central focus of headlines and social media discussions. Legal analysts appeared on cable news panels debating whether Thorne's sentence was a judicial error, a calculated strategy to influence public opinion, or even grounds for judicial misconduct proceedings. This appears to be a deliberate attempt to create a media narrative rather than a good faith application of established law, suggested CNN's legal analyst, while Fox News countered with commentary supporting harsher penalties for juvenile offenders regardless of age. If an 11-year-old is sophisticated enough to research poison dosages and administer them, they're sophisticated enough to face real consequences. Within 24 hours of the sentencing, the Oregon Attorney General's office took the unusual step of issuing a statement distancing themselves from Judge Thorne's decision. "While we respect the independence of the judiciary, the Department of Justice recognizes that Supreme Court precedent clearly prohibits life without parole sentences for juvenile offenders. We anticipate the sentence will be modified through appropriate appellate processes." This public undermining of Thorne's position by state authorities underscored the extraordinary nature of the situation, with legal experts noting that such statements typically only occur in cases of clear judicial overreach. The national attention brought renewed scrutiny to the evidence that had been excluded during trial, with investigative journalists from The Washington Post and ProPublica requesting court records and conducting interviews with medical professionals familiar with Munchausen by proxy syndrome. Dr. Leora Prynne, whose outburst in court had drawn attention to Amy Weldon's prior diagnosis, found herself at the center of this journalistic investigation, carefully navigating patient confidentiality requirements while confirming that she had indeed diagnosed Amy with the condition years before the murder. "I filed reports with appropriate authorities that were not adequately investigated," Prynne told the Portland Tribune in a carefully worded statement that avoided disclosing protected therapeutic communications while still conveying her professional concerns. On the morning following sentencing, the defense team filed an emergency appeal with the Oregon Court of Appeals, citing multiple grounds for reversal, including the unconstitutionality of the sentence under Miller v. Alabama, judicial bias throughout the proceedings, and the systematic exclusion of exculpatory evidence. This case represents a perfect storm of judicial overreach, from the pre-trial rulings excluding critical medical evidence to the blatantly unconstitutional sentence designed to generate media attention rather than serve justice, Voss stated in the accompanying press release, his usual professional restraint giving way to open criticism of Judge Thorne's handling of the case. The national spotlight also brought renewed attention to Marcus Weldon, whose testimony about his attempts to warn and protect his daughter from prison had resonated with many observers. Riverbend Penitentiary found itself fielding media requests for interviews with the incarcerated father, whose wire fraud conviction suddenly seemed less relevant than his desperate efforts to save his daughter from poisoning. He tried to work within a system that was stacked against him, a convicted felon trying to convince authorities that the devoted mother everyone admired was actually slowly killing their child, explained Marcus's attorney, Sophia Rivera, in an interview that highlighted the parallels between father and daughter, both imprisoned and disbelieved. 3 days after the sentencing, in a development that would dramatically shift the narrative once again, the Portland Police Bureau held a press conference announcing the discovery of new evidence related to the Weldon case. Detective Kira Ross, standing beside Chief Michael Lawson, revealed that execution of a search warrant at Craig Vaughn's residence had uncovered documents directly linking him to Amy Weldon's financial schemes. We have recovered extensive correspondence between Mr. Vaughn and Amy Weldon, detailing plans to collect on Tina's life insurance policy following what they referred to as her inevitable decline, Ross stated, her professional demeanor not entirely masking her personal investment in exposing the truth. These documents explicitly discuss accelerating Tina's condition to ensure her death before her 12th birthday to maximize the insurance payout under the double indemnity clause. This revelation transformed public perception of the case, with even those who had been most convinced of Tina's calculated guilt now questioning whether the child had indeed acted in desperate self-defense against a mother and her accomplice, who were actively planning her death for financial gain. Craig Vaughn was taken into custody on charges of conspiracy to commit murder and insurance fraud. His arrest captured by news helicopters hovering above his North Portland home, the footage playing on a continuous loop on local stations as commentators discussed the implications for Tina's case. If this evidence had been presented at trial, it's almost inconceivable that the jury would have reached the same verdict, noted legal analyst Martin Chen on KPTV's Evening News. This raises serious questions about Judge Thorne's exclusion of the insurance policy evidence that the defense repeatedly attempted to introduce. Meanwhile, in the juvenile detention center, Tina's daily routine continued despite the media circus surrounding her case, attending classes in the facility's school program, participating in group therapy sessions, and meeting with Dr. Patricia Novak for individual psychological treatment. The child psychologist noted in her session reports that Tina showed signs of complex trauma response but was beginning to engage more emotionally as she felt safer in the structured environment, away from the systematic poisoning that had affected both her physical and psychological development for years. She's starting to process what happened to her, both her mother's actions and her own, Dr. Novak explained to Julian Voss during a case conference. The dissociative patterns that appeared as emotional flatness during trial are gradually giving way to more age-appropriate emotional expression. A week after sentencing, as Portland continued to debate the case and national media maintained their coverage of what was now being called the poison child case, another significant development emerged from an unexpected source. Henrik Voss, a neighbor of the Weldons who shared no relation to Tina's attorney, despite the surname coincidence, came forward with eyewitness testimony after watching coverage of the case on television. "I saw Amy forcing Tina to drink what she called her special medicine multiple times," Henrik stated in a sworn affidavit filed with the appeals court as supplementary evidence. "The child would cry and resist, but Amy would hold her nose until she had to open her mouth to breathe, then pour the liquid in. I wanted to report it, but Amy was highly regarded in our church community, and I feared retaliation from church elders who considered her a saint for caring for her sick daughter." This eyewitness account provided external corroboration of Tina's claims about being forced to consume the poisoned medicine, directly contradicting the prosecution's theory that Tina had been self-administering ethylene glycol to frame her mother. Henrik's testimony included specific dates and times, including an incident just 3 days before Amy's death, when he observed through his kitchen window as Amy held Tina down on the couch and administered what he now believed was the poisoned chocolate milk referenced in court documents. "The girl was fighting hard that time, harder than I'd seen before. It was like she knew what was in it and was desperate to avoid drinking it." As these developments unfolded in rapid succession, Judge Magnus Thorne found himself facing increasing scrutiny from judicial oversight bodies and the legal community. The Oregon Commission on Judicial Fitness and Disability confirmed receipt of multiple complaints regarding Thorne's handling of the Weldon case, including allegations of bias, improper exclusion of relevant evidence, and imposing a sentence known to violate constitutional standards. While the Commission's investigations were confidential, legal experts speculated that Thorne could face formal sanctions or even removal from the bench if the Commission found he had deliberately violated his oath to uphold the Constitution for political or personal reasons. 14 days after Judge Thorne's dramatic "die in prison" pronouncement, the Oregon Court of Appeals issued an emergency stay of the sentence pending full review of the case, ordering that Tina remain in juvenile detention rather than being processed into the adult correctional system as Thorne's sentence would have required. The court's order was accompanied by an unusual preliminary statement expressing grave concerns about both the constitutionality of the sentence imposed and the overall conduct of the trial proceedings, language that signaled likely reversal of not just the sentence, but potentially the conviction itself. This judicial intervention, combined with the continuing revelations about Amy Weldon's conspiracy with Craig Vaughn and the eyewitness testimony corroborating Tina's account, created a dramatic shift in public opinion across Portland and beyond. The case that had initially been presented as a shocking example of childhood depravity was increasingly being reframed as a tragic story of a child victim who had taken desperate measures when all systems designed to protect her had failed. Outside the juvenile detention center where Tina remained in custody, the protesters now carried signs reading "System on Trial, Not Tina," and "Who Protects Children When Adults Fail?" As Portland grappled with the implications of this evolving narrative, Judge Magnus Thorne released a public statement defending his handling of the case, a move widely criticized as inappropriate while appeals were pending. The judicial process requires difficult decisions that may not always be popular or fully understood by those without access to all evidence and legal considerations, Thorne wrote, his statement notably failing to address the specific constitutional issues raised by his sentence or the exclusion of evidence now being revealed as critical to understanding the case. "I stand by my rulings and trust the appellate process to fulfill its proper function in our legal system." The statement did little to quell growing calls for Thorne's recusal from future cases involving juveniles or to address concerns about whether his personal views on juvenile justice had improperly influenced his handling of the Weldon trial. As national attention remained focused on Portland and its judicial system, The small figure at the center of the controversy, Tina Grace Weldon, continued her daily routine in detention, reading books from the facility's limited library, completing schoolwork, and slowly beginning to process the trauma of her mother's years-long attempt to kill her, all while awaiting the legal system's next determination of her fate. The bright television lights illuminated the Portland studio where KPTV anchor Catherine Morgan delivered the evening news headline that had captivated the city for weeks. Breaking: Appeals Court overturns Weldon murder conviction, orders new trial. Behind her, the screen displayed side-by-side images, Judge Magnus Thorne's stern official portrait juxtaposed with the now infamous courtroom sketch of 11-year-old Tina Weldon standing for sentencing, the contrast between powerful adult and diminutive child visually reinforcing the David versus Goliath narrative that had emerged. In a blistering 87-page opinion, the Oregon Court of Appeals has unanimously reversed Tina Weldon's murder conviction, citing pervasive judicial error and systematic exclusion of exculpatory evidence that denied the defendant a fair trial. The appellate decision, released exactly 30 days after Judge Thorne's controversial die in prison sentencing declaration, represented a comprehensive rejection of both the trial process and its outcome. The three-judge panel had not only overturned the conviction, but had taken the unusual step of directly addressing Thorne's handling of the case. The trial court's pattern of evidentiary rulings consistently prevented the jury from hearing critical medical evidence that would have directly supported the defendant's claim of self-defense against ongoing poisoning by the victim. Combined with the blatantly unconstitutional sentence imposed, these errors suggest a level of judicial bias that fundamentally compromised the fairness of the proceedings. At the downtown offices of Voss & Associates, Julian Voss held a press conference surrounded by his legal team and child welfare advocates who had supported Tina's defense. Today's ruling confirms what we have maintained throughout this tragic case. Tina Weldon acted to save her own life after years of systematic poisoning by her mother, a fact that the jury never fully heard due to Judge Thorne's improper exclusion of critical evidence. Voss's normally reserved demeanor gave way to visible emotion as he continued, "An 11-year-old child was not only poisoned by the person meant to protect her, but then further victimized by a legal system that refused to hear her truth." The appellate decision specifically highlighted several categories of wrongfully excluded evidence. Tina's June 10th medical records showing lethal levels of ethylene glycol already in her system 2 days before her mother's death. Dr. Leora Prin's diagnosis of Amy Weldon with Munchausen by proxy syndrome 5 years earlier. The life insurance policy with the double indemnity clause tied to Tina's death before her 12th birthday. And financial records showing that Amy and her secret boyfriend, Craig Vaughn, stood to collect $1 million upon Tina's death. When viewed collectively, this excluded evidence provides compelling support for the defendant's claim that she acted in necessary self-defense against imminent threat to her life, the appellate judges wrote, making its exclusion particularly prejudicial to the defense. Multnomah County District Attorney Eleanor Matthews faced difficult questions at her own press conference later that afternoon, with journalists pressing her on whether her office would pursue a second trial, given the evidence now publicly available. "We are reviewing the appellate decision and will make a determination based on a comprehensive reassessment of all evidence, including that which was previously excluded." Matthews's careful phrasing suggested a dramatic shift from her office's earlier certainty about Tina's guilt, with legal analysts predicting that a second prosecution was unlikely given the overwhelming evidence of Amy's Munchausen by proxy and the conspiracy with Vaughn to collect on Tina's life insurance. The day following the appellate decision, Portland's major newspaper, The Oregonian, published a front-page investigative report examining how multiple systems had failed to protect Tina despite numerous warning signs over the years. The article detailed how Dr. Prin's report to Oregon Child Protective Services had been dismissed after Amy threatened legal action against both the therapist and the agency, how Portland Children's Hospital had noted concerning patterns in Tina's admissions, but failed to connect them to potential medical child abuse, and how the church community had unwittingly enabled Amy's behavior through fundraising and support that reinforced her identity as a devoted caregiver. This case represents a perfect storm of system failures, the article concluded, raising troubling questions about how many other children might be suffering similar abuse beneath a veneer of parental devotion. Public reaction to the appellate decision reflected the dramatic shift in perception that had occurred since the initial child killer headlines following Tina's arrest. Justice at last for Tina declared protest signs outside the courthouse, while social media hashtags like So System Failed Tina and Believe Children trended locally. Even those who had initially supported Amy began questioning their assumptions as the full evidence of her years-long poisoning campaign became public, with several church members expressing guilt and remorse over their unwitting role in supporting the false narrative of the devoted mother caring for a chronically ill child. The case's resolution took an unexpected turn when Multnomah County District Attorney Matthews announced that her office would not pursue a second trial against Tina Weldon, effectively ending the criminal case against the child. After comprehensive review of all evidence, including that which was improperly excluded from the original trial, we have determined that Tina Weldon acted in legitimate self-defense against a lethal threat to her life. The announcement included the formal filing of new charges against Craig Vaughn for conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, and child endangerment, with prosecutors describing him as an active participant in Amy Weldon's plan to murder her daughter for financial gain. With the criminal charges dismissed, attention turned to Tina's future and the question of where she would live following her release from juvenile detention. This challenge was complicated by her father's continued incarceration at Riverbend Penitentiary for wire fraud, though Marcus Weldon's attorney had filed for compassionate early release based on the extraordinary circumstances of his daughter's case and his attempts to protect her from prison. The Oregon Department of Human Services stepped in with a temporary placement in a specialized therapeutic foster home, while more permanent arrangements were evaluated, with emphasis on Tina's need for ongoing psychological treatment to address both the trauma of her mother's abuse and the complex grief of having taken her mother's life, even in self-defense. Dr. Patricia Novak, who had worked with Tina throughout her detention, spoke about the psychological challenges facing the child in a carefully anonymized educational interview with Oregon Public Broadcasting. Children who survive Munchausen by proxy abuse face unique recovery challenges because their trauma came from the very person they were biologically programmed to trust, Dr. Novak explained, providing context without violating confidentiality. When the child has been forced to take extreme measures in self-defense, as in this case, they must then integrate not only the trauma of being victimized, but also the complex moral and emotional reality of having harmed their abuser. 6 weeks after the appellate decision, the Oregon Judicial Fitness Commission announced formal proceedings against Judge Magnus Thorne, citing pattern of behavior inconsistent with judicial ethics and constitutional obligations in his handling of the Weldon case. The Commission's investigation had been expanded to include review of Thorne's rulings in other juvenile cases, revealing what the Commission described as concerning bias against juvenile defendants and dismissive attitude toward developmental considerations in assessing culpability. While the disciplinary process would take months to complete, legal experts predicted serious consequences, potentially including removal from the bench, with several noting that Thorne's die-in-prison declaration appeared deliberately calculated to create media sensation rather than apply established law. The case that had begun with sensational, child killer headlines now concluded with very different media coverage as journalists examined the systemic failures that had allowed Amy Weldon's abuse to continue for years, despite warning signs that should have triggered intervention. National news magazines published in-depth features on Munchausen by proxy syndrome, explaining how perpetrators like Amy Weldon can successfully deceive medical professionals, community members, and even their victims through sophisticated manipulation and performance of the devoted caregiver role. The most dangerous aspect of this form of child abuse is that it hides behind a facade of extraordinary parental dedication, explained Dr. Eleanor Fitzgerald, a leading national expert on the syndrome, in a Time magazine article featuring Tina's case. The perpetrator is often praised and supported for their seemingly tireless devotion to their child's care, creating a protective shield of public admiration that makes accusations of abuse seem unthinkable. Portland's medical community responded to the case with new protocols designed to better identify potential Munchausen by proxy cases, including systematic tracking of emergency room visits across different hospitals, more rigorous documentation of symptoms that appear only when the parent is present, and mandatory consultation with child abuse specialists when certain patterns emerge. Portland Children's Hospital, where Amy had taken Tina for numerous visits over the years, instituted special training for emergency department staff focused on recognizing the warning signs that had been missed in Tina's case, with Dr. Elaine Winters, who had testified at the trial, leading the educational initiative. On a crisp fall morning, 4 months after Judge Thorne's infamous sentencing declaration, Tina Weldon left the Juvenile Detention Center for the last time, emerging into the bright Portland sunshine in the company of her court-appointed guardian ad litem and her therapist, Dr. Novak. No cameras were permitted at the release, with the court having imposed strict privacy protections to give Tina the opportunity to begin healing away from media scrutiny. In a brief statement released through her attorney, Tina expressed gratitude to those who had advocated for her and asked for privacy as she began learning how to be a normal kid again, something I've never really had the chance to experience. The final chapter in the legal proceedings came with Marcus Weldon's compassionate release from Riverbend Penitentiary, granted after review of his attempts to protect his daughter and recognition of the extraordinary circumstances of the case. Though his wire fraud conviction remained on his record, the judge who approved his release noted that Mr. Weldon's efforts to warn authorities and protect his daughter from within prison demonstrate a moral character not reflected in his original conviction. The conditions of his release included continued supervision and completion of his restitution payments, but allowed him to participate in Tina's life under appropriate professional guidance to help rebuild their father-daughter relationship. 1 year after Amy Weldon's death, Portland had largely moved on from the daily headlines about the case, though its impact continued to reverberate through changes in child protection policies, medical protocols, and increased awareness of Munchausen by proxy syndrome. Judge Magnus Thorne had been removed from the bench following the Judicial Fitness Commission's investigation, which found that his die-in-prison sentence had been a deliberate attempt to create media sensation through knowingly unconstitutional sentencing, a violation of judicial ethics severe enough to warrant removal rather than mere censure or temporary suspension. In a quiet Portland neighborhood far from the Selwood home where the tragedy had unfolded, Tina Weldon began 7th grade under a different name, her privacy protected by court order and the cooperation of school officials aware of her history, but committed to giving her the chance at normalcy she deserved. Her therapeutic foster placement had transitioned to a permanent guardianship with a family specially trained in supporting children who had experienced severe trauma, with Marcus Weldon permitted regular supervised visits as part of Tina's ongoing family therapy. Dr. Novak, who continued to provide Tina's psychological treatment, reported steady progress in her recovery, noting that the resilience of children, even those who have endured the most extreme circumstances, remains our greatest ally in the healing process. The case that had begun with the shocking image of an 11-year-old child killer had transformed public understanding of the complex realities of child abuse, the failures of systems meant to protect the vulnerable, and the extraordinary measures to which a child might be driven when all other avenues of safety have failed. In professional conferences, academic papers, and policy discussions across the country, the Weldon case became a reference point for examining how preconceived notions about devoted motherhood can blind communities and institutions to dangerous abuse hiding in plain sight, and how the legal system's treatment of juvenile defendants requires fundamental reconsideration of culpability, developmental capacity, and proportionate justice. On the anniversary of the appellate decision that had overturned her conviction, Tina, now using her new legal name to protect her privacy, wrote a letter to Julian Voss, the attorney who had fought so determinedly for her truth to be heard. The letter, which Voss later described as the most meaningful professional validation I've ever received, included a simple drawing of a girl standing in sunshine and the carefully printed words, "Thank you for believing me when nobody else would." This quiet expression of gratitude from a child who had endured unimaginable trauma and then navigated a legal system that initially failed to recognize her victimization served as a powerful reminder of why the protections of due process and the presumption of innocence matter most for the most vulnerable among us, those without the power, voice, or resources to defend themselves against both individual harm and systemic failure.